That night, Evelyn Carter was still in her black funeral dress when Grant Carter laid the stack of property transfer papers down in front of her. Not the next morning. Not after she'd had a chance to sleep. Not after the sound of dirt hitting the lid of Thomas's coffin had stopped echoing in her head. But that very night, while the scent of white funeral flowers still lingered in the living room, while the casseroles from neighbors sat untouched on the kitchen counter, while Evelyn hadn't even had a chance to take off the shoes that had been blistering her heels all day. Grant sat across from her at the dining table, his gray suit still so crisp he could have walked straight out of a boardroom, not a cemetery. 47 years old, a corporate lawyer, with a voice just low enough to sound controlled, just slow enough to make you feel like you were the one who didn't understand. Next to Grant was Ryan Carter, the 43-year-old younger brother, with a softer face and a more evasive gaze. But sometimes Evelyn thought Ryan was dangerous in a different way. Grant chilled you with his sharpness. Ryan hurt you because he always wrapped his selfishness in a blanket of concern. Evelyn, Grant said, pushing the stack of papers toward her. We need to sort a few things out before they get complicated. Evelyn looked down at the pages. Black print, dense legalese. The kind of words Thomas had promised she would never have to face alone. She could still hear his voice in her memory. Don't you worry, Evie. I've taken care of everything. She had believed him. Believed him like a wife believes the man she cared for through his final months. Believed him like a woman who gave up her career teaching high school literature to build a home with him, to host his business partners, to look after his relatives, to remember every grandchild's birthday, and to sit by his bed dawn nights when the painkillers didn't work as well as the doctors had hoped. Ryan placed a cup of tea in front of her. You should drink something. Today must have been so hard for you, not for us. In that one small sentence, Evelyn understood her place in this room perfectly. She was their father's widow, but she was not their family. Grant opened the folder. Dad wanted the family assets to stay in the bloodline. The sentence landed on the dining table so lightly it was almost polite. But Evelyn felt something inside her chest tear. Bloodline. Bloodline. A word that was clean, neat, legal, and brutal. 23 years in this house, 23 years loving Thomas, caring for Thomas, upholding the holidays, the dinners, the family calls, patching the cracks no one else wanted to look at. And now, just hours after he was gone, it all came down to one simple thing. She was not blood. Grant continued, as if he were reading a report. The house in Portland will be transferred into joint ownership between me and Ryan. Same for the cabin in Idaho. The remaining shares in Carter Freight will be handled according to Dad's old trust. Evelyn looked up. And me? Ryan glanced at Grant before answering. You have the life insurance policy. How much? Grant looked down at his papers. $200,000. Evelyn didn't say anything at first. She just stared at the cream-colored tablecloth she had picked out herself one autumn 6 years ago. Thomas had said it was too expensive for a tablecloth. Then he bought it anyway because he saw her smile when she touched the fabric. $200,000 at 63 years old. After more than 2 decades as a wife. After leaving her teaching career. After becoming the woman behind everything, but whose name was on almost nothing. Thomas told me I would be taken care of, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Grant sighed. Dad said a lot of things to an end. Sickness. It makes people sentimental. Evelyn looked him straight in the eye. He wasn't losing his mind. No one's saying that. Ryan jumped in quickly. We just mean the family assets have a certain structure. You know that, Evelyn. Dad always wanted to keep the business in the Carter bloodline. The Carter bloodline. For years, Evelyn had told herself that if she was just patient, one day Thomas's sons would see she wasn't there to replace their mother. She never made them call her mom. Never tried to step into memories. that weren't hers. She just cooked their favorite meals when they came home, sent birthday gifts to their children, sat at the far end of the table during family gatherings, and learned not to feel the sting when someone would say family photo, and forget to call her into the frame. But tonight, Evelyn understood something with perfect clarity. Some people will never open the door for you. They just let you stand on the porch long enough to make you think it's your home. Grant pulled out another sheet of paper. There's one more thing. Evelyn looked down at his hands. Clean hands, neatly trimmed nails, an expensive watch. Meanwhile, her own hand still had a small bruise from where the nurse had removed Thomas's IV line too quickly on that last day. The medical expenses from the final months were substantial, Grant said. Insurance covered most of it, but there's still an outstanding balance of about $187,000. The room seemed to shrink. Evelyn heard the sound of rain against the window behind her. It had been raining all day in Portland, a persistent drizzle that blurred everything outside like an old painting. Are you saying that I'm responsible for that? Ryan dropped his gaze to his teacup. Legally, you are his spouse. You were also the one who signed off on many of the treatment decisions. Treatment decisions. The way he said it turned those horrific nights in the hospital into a financial record. She remembered Thomas squeezing her hand, his eyes red with pain, trying to tell her he was just so tired. She remembered the doctor standing at the foot of the bed, his voice soft but clear, asking if she wanted to try one more procedure. She remembered signing her name through tears because there were no good choices left. Only the choice that might cause him a little less pain. And now, those signatures were coming back as a debt. Evelyn placed her hands on the edge of the table to keep them from shaking. Which means, after paying that, I'll have almost nothing left. No one denied it. That was the part that hurt the most. It wasn't that they didn't know. They knew. Grant sat up a little straighter. We don't want this to become contentious. If you cooperate, you can stay in the house for 30 days to get your things in order. 30 days. 30 days to pack 23 years into cardboard boxes. 30 days to leave the kitchen where Thomas used to stand making coffee every morning. 30 days to take their wedding photo off the wall. 30 days to disappear from the life she thought was hers. Evelyn's gaze drifted across the living room. On the mantelpiece, there was still that photo of her and Thomas on the Oregon coast. The wind was strong that day, her hair was a mess, and Thomas was laughing because she kept trying to hold onto her scarf. He had put his arm on her shoulder, pulled her in close, and told the person with the camera to take it quick, before my wife changes her mind. My wife. Not the housekeeper, not just a could be crossed off a document with one word, Bloodline. I need time, Evelyn said. Grant closed the folder. Of course. We'll be back tomorrow morning. Ryan stood up after his brother. We just really want to make this as easy as possible. Evelyn looked at Ryan for a moment. Some words sound like kindness, but they're really just a way of asking you not to make them feel guilty. She didn't answer. The two of them left to the sound of the rain and the front door closing very softly. Afterward, the house grew so quiet, Evelyn could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. She sat alone at the dining table for a long time, not crying. The tears seemed to have run dry that afternoon, when people were tossing flowers on Thomas's casket and someone patted her shoulder, telling her how strong she was. People have a way of calling a woman strong when they don't know what else to do to help. Finally, Evelyn got up and walked down the hall to Thomas's study. The room still smelled of him. Old paper, pine wood, black coffee, and the aftershave he'd used for years. His wool jacket was still hanging on the back of the chair. His reading glasses were still lying next to the desk lamp. A leather-bound notebook lay open to the last page. Thomas's handwriting slanted slightly, as always. Evelyn sat down in his chair, And that's when the pain truly hit her. Not the pain of a wife who'd lost her husband, but the pain of a woman realizing just how quickly she could be erased. Now that the only person who protected her presence was gone. She pulled open the bottom drawer, looking for a tissue. The drawer was stuck. Thomas had promised to fix it. He'd promised many times. Each time, he'd just smile and say, "I'll get to it next week." Evelyn pulled harder. A small metal object slid out from behind a stack of old papers, landing on the hardwood floor with a soft clink. She bent down to pick it up. It was an old brass key, its edges slightly worn, tied to a small tag with no name, just a series of handwritten numbers. Evelyn sat motionless in her late husband's study. For the first time all day, through the funeral, the paperwork, the debt, and the humiliation, she felt something in the darkness crack open just a little. And deep down, she knew Thomas had left something behind for her, something Grant and Ryan knew nothing about. Evelyn barely slept the first night after the funeral. She lay on her side, on the part of the bed where Thomas had slept for the past 23 years, watching the faint glow of a streetlight filter through the curtains and listening to the steady rhythm of the Portland rain on the roof. Sometimes she thought she could hear him coughing downstairs. Other times, she imagined the coffee maker switching on, just like it every morning. But now, the house was just silent. The kind of silence that makes you understand a life has truly ended. The key she'd found was still in her palm, strangely cold and heavy. Evelyn didn't know what it opened, but all night she thought of it as a kind of unfinished sentence from Thomas. She finally drifted off for a short while, just before dawn. When she woke up, her back was stiff from sleeping in the wrong position, and her mind felt heavy, as if shrouded in fog. She went down to the kitchen out of habit, almost forgetting there was no one sitting at the table waiting for coffee anymore. Thomas had loved the quiet mornings. He always woke up about 20 minutes before her, made his own coffee, and then opened the back door to look out at the small patio where Evelyn grew lavender and rosemary in old terracotta pots. He wasn't a movie-style romantic. He didn't buy surprise flowers every week. He didn't write love letters. He could never remember the date of their first date. But Thomas always filled up her gas tank on winter nights because he knew how much Evelyn hated standing out in the cold the next morning. He remembered the kind of soup she liked when she had a headache. He always left the porch light on if she was coming home late. Thomas's love was in those small things, so quiet that Evelyn once thought it would be enough to keep her safe forever. She stood in the kitchen for a long time that morning. Then her eyes drifted to the wooden board hanging near the refrigerator. An old note was still pinned there, in Thomas's handwriting. "Buy lemons. Call Ethan. Pick up Evelyn's medication." Evelyn touched the last line so gently. For years, she had thought this family would eventually come to see her as a natural part of it, if only she was patient enough. But maybe some doors don't open with time, only with blood. Evelyn met Thomas when she was 39. At the time, she was a literature teacher at a high school in Eugene. Her first marriage had ended early, childless. Thomas, nearly 10 years her senior, had been a widower for years, raising 2 college-aged sons on his own. The first time they met, he spilled coffee on her dress in a bookstore. He was so flustered that he bought the 3 books she was holding and asked her to dinner as an apology. 2 years later, they were married. Evelyn had once thought the biggest challenge of marrying into a family with grown children would be the age gap. She was wrong. The hardest part was learning how to exist in a space where others were still quietly holding a place for another woman. Ethan and Ryan were never rude to her. That's what made it hurt more. If they had screamed or insulted her, maybe Evelyn would have known how to react. But they were always polite. Too polite. The kind of polite you are with a long-term guest. In family photos, they always stood together, with Evelyn at the edge. At Thanksgiving, they would ask if she needed help, but they never asked if she was tired. When telling stories from their childhood, they said, "our family," in a way that made it clear she wasn't a part of those memories. One Christmas, 8 years after they were married, Evelyn spent almost 2 days preparing dinner for the whole family. She remembered that Ryan liked extra gravy on his turkey, that Ethan didn't eat cranberry sauce, that Ethan's daughter had a pecan allergy. She remembered it all, but when everyone raised their glasses for a toast, Ethan stood up and said, "Mom would loved seeing all of us together like this." Their mother. No one had done anything wrong. Thomas just silently squeezed Evelyn's hand under the table, as if to say he understood. But he never said it out loud. That was how Thomas had dealt with conflict his entire life. Avoid it until it went away. Years ago, Evelyn had tried talking to him about that feeling of not belonging. Thomas had been reading the financial section in the living room when she said, "Sometimes I feel like they're just tolerating me." Thomas folded his paper, pulled her down to sit beside him, and said, "Just give them time." But time doesn't always bring people closer. Sometimes it just makes the distance more polite. After Thomas got sick, Evelyn practically gave up her own life. She quit teaching her class at the community college, stopped going to her Wednesday book club, stopped tending to her garden. Her life shrank too. Medications, doctor's appointments, insurance, warm soup, and sleepless nights listening to her husband's labored breathing. Ethan and Ryan had called. They'd sent money a few times. They'd stopped by the hospital. But they always left right when it got uncomfortable. No one stayed when Thomas threw up after chemo. No one wiped him down when he had a high fever in the middle of the night. No one heard him break down, crying in the bathroom the first time he couldn't put on his own shirt. It was Evelyn, always Evelyn. And yet, just a few hours after the funeral, she was now the one who could be pushed out of that house in 30 days. That afternoon, the lawyer, Victor Hale, called her to his office. Victor had known Thomas for almost 15 years. His office was in an old building in downtown Portland. Not luxurious, but it always smelled of wood and freshly brewed coffee. Victor looked at Evelyn for a long moment after she sat down. "Are you getting any sleep?" Evelyn gave a tired smile. "I don't remember." Victor opened the file in front of him. "I've reviewed the will." Evelyn looked down at the papers. "I just don't understand how Thomas could have left things like this." Victor took off his glasses. "To be honest, I don't believe this was the final decision he wanted either." The room was quiet for a few seconds. Then Victor leaned toward her. "Evelyn, you have the right to contest the will." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "I think something's wrong. The timeline for the will's revision is too close to when Thomas was at his weakest, and Grant is pushing for everything to happen far too quickly." Victor paused. "If you want, we can take this to court." Evelyn was silent. She thought she would feel angry or want to fight, but all she felt was exhaustion. Exhausted from the hospital. Exhausted from the grief. Exhausted from trying to prove she belonged in a place that had never truly opened its doors to her. Victor watched her intently. "You don't have to decide right now." Evelyn turned her head to the window behind him. It was still raining in Portland. Pedestrians on the street below pulled their collars up, all of them with a place to go home to. She wasn't so sure anymore. After a very long moment, Evelyn finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, but so calm it surprised even herself. "Give them what they want." 2 days after the meeting with Victor Hale, Grant called Evelyn around 6 in the evening. His voice was lighter than it had been at her house. Almost friendly. "Ryan and I thought it would be good if the family got together before we handle the paperwork. Just for dinner." The family. Evelyn almost laughed when she heard that phrase. For over 20 years, she'd been called family whenever they needed her to soften up. She looked at the key sitting on the kitchen table next to her cold cup of tea. Where Ryan's place? Grant was silent for a few seconds, as if surprised she'd agreed so easily. 7 o'clock. When the call ended, Evelyn stood still in the kitchen for a long time. For a very long time in her life, every time Grant called to invite her to dinner, she had tried to prepare herself perfectly. She would change into a nice dress, bring a dessert that Ryan liked, and then remind herself not to be too sensitive if they only talked about work with Thomas all evening. But tonight was different. For the first time, Evelyn was no longer walking into that room with the hope of being accepted. And strangely, that made her feel much calmer. Ryan lived in a new house in Lake Oswego, a wealthy area south of Portland. The house was large and modern, its exterior covered in dark-tinted glass and imported gray stone. The kind of house built to be looked at. But as soon as she walked in, Evelyn felt something was off. It wasn't any clear evidence, just small details. Too many small details. The SUV in the driveway still had a temporary registration sticker. The smell of new paint hadn't faded yet. The smart glass lighting inside would flicker slightly, as if it hadn't been fully installed. A large painting near the staircase was hanging crooked, but no one had fixed it. Genuinely wealthy people usually live in a state of stability. People trying to appear wealthy always seem like they're chasing something. Ryan opened the door with a smile that came too quickly. "Evelyn, you're here." He gave her a very light hug, the kind of hug from someone who's afraid they'll be held responsible for your emotions if it lasts longer than a few seconds. Inside, the house smelled of rosemary and hot butter. Ryan's girlfriend, Melissa, was setting the table. She was nearly 15 years younger than Ryan, beautiful in a very well-maintained way. Perfect hair, perfect nails, perfect smile. But Evelyn immediately noticed the tension around her eyes when she saw her. Grant was already there. He was standing near the bar with a scotch in his hand, his steel watch gleaming under the kitchen lights. Evelyn. Grant always said her name the way a lawyer addresses a witness. Not close, not intimate, just control. The dinner began normally enough. Grilled salmon, white wine, soft jazz in the background. Melissa tried to keep the mood light by talking about a new resort in Napa she wanted to visit in the summer. Ryan laughed a little too loudly. Grant kept checking his phone when he thought no one was looking. Evelyn barely said a word. And that was what was making them so uncomfortable. In the past, whenever things got tense, she would try to smooth things over, ask questions, smile, change the subject, but tonight she just watched. She noticed Ryan was drinking faster than usual. Grant replied to texts almost instantly, every time his phone buzzed. Melissa kept glancing between the two brothers, as if looking for some kind of confirmation. Something was making them nervous. And Evelyn was beginning to understand that this might not be as simple as she had thought. Grant set his wine glass down first. "What did Victor Hale tell you?" The question came so abruptly. No preamble. Evelyn gently dabbed her lips with her napkin. "He said I have the right to contest the will." Melissa's head shot up. Ryan forced a laugh. "Well, any lawyer would say that." Grant didn't smile. "And what do you think?" Evelyn looked at him for a few seconds before answering, her voice perfectly calm. "I think Thomas wasn't the kind of man to leave a mess behind after he was gone." Grant tensed up slightly, just for a moment. But Evelyn saw it. Years of being a teacher had made her good at noticing the smallest human reactions. A glance that darted away too quickly, a hand that clenched and then released, a slight pause before giving an answer. Those things often said so much more than words ever could. Ryan spoke up. Dad was very weak at the end. Maybe he didn't get all the paperwork updated. Paperwork. That word caught her attention. "Is that right?" Grant cut in immediately. "What Ryan means is, the illness made it harder to keep track of everything." Evelyn nodded very slowly. Then she set her fork down. "I've been trying to understand a few things myself." The atmosphere at the table changed almost instantly. Grant sat up straighter. What do you mean by that? I've started looking through Thomas's papers. Old bank accounts, company files, a few things in his office. Ryan grabbed his wine glass so quickly that the wine sloshed over the rim. Did you find anything? Evelyn looked at him. It was the first time all evening Ryan had actually lost his composure. Not much. Grant's voice was perfectly steady. If you need any help reading the financial documents, just let me know. A lot of the business paperwork can be quite complex. It was exactly the kind of line Grant had used for the past 20 years. It sounded like an offer of help. But really, it was a reminder that she didn't belong in their world. Evelyn offered a faint smile. I taught literature, not finance. But I think I can manage to read the basics. Grant was silent. Melissa got up to pour more wine, even though no one had asked. Ryan tried to change the subject. How long are you planning on staying in the house? I haven't decided yet. Grant thinks it would be better for the market if we sold sooner rather than later. Grant shot a glance at his brother. A very quick one, but Evelyn caught it. They were antsy. It wasn't just about the inheritance. It was as if they were afraid of time itself. The key in her jacket pocket suddenly felt heavier. Evelyn took a sip of water, then said casually, I found something a little strange in Thomas's desk. Grant looked up instantly. Ryan stopped cutting his fish. What was it? A key. For a few seconds, no one said a word. Melissa looked over at Grant. Grant looked directly at Evelyn. What kind of key? I'm not sure. She kept her voice perfectly casual. It looks old. It's attached to a tag with a series of numbers. Ryan tried to laugh it off. Dad held on to all sorts of things, perhaps. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. But Thomas wasn't the type to keep something meaningless in his personal desk drawer. Grant placed his glass down very quietly. The sound was small but cold. Could you let me see it? Not at the moment. The air at the table froze. Evelyn realized the strangest thing in that moment wasn't the tension. It was the feeling that she was no longer afraid of them. For years, every time Grant gave her that cold look, Evelyn would immediately wonder if she had said something wrong. But tonight, she just observed. Grant was worried, genuinely worried. Ryan was the first to speak. Evelyn, do you think that key could be for a safe deposit box? The entire table fell silent instantly. Evelyn barely remembered how she left Ryan's house after that question. Do you think that key could be for a safe deposit box? The moment Ryan uttered those last three words, it was as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. Grant didn't look at his brother, but his jaw was clenched. Melissa stood frozen by the kitchen counter, the wine bottle still in her hand. And in that exact second, Evelyn understood something with perfect clarity. They knew what that key was for. Or at least, they were afraid of what it could be for. Evelyn didn't answer right away. She simply dabbed her lips with her napkin and slowly stood up. I think it's getting late. Grant immediately followed her to the door. Evelyn. His voice was completely different from earlier in the evening. The calm composure of a corporate lawyer was gone. There was an urgency beneath his controlled surface. If Dad left any separate paperwork, you should let me look at it. Some of the documents might not be finalized. Evelyn put on her coat. Thomas was always thorough. Grant watched her for a few seconds. For the first time in over 20 years, Evelyn saw uncertainty in his eyes. As she drove away from Lake Oswego, the Portland rain was still coming down. The yellow streetlights smeared across the wet pavement, blurring behind the windshield. The city at night looked both lonely and beautiful, in a way that makes you remember past versions of yourself. Evelyn didn't go straight home. She parked by the Willamette River and sat in silence for a long time, the key resting in the palm of her hand. Thomas had never told her about any safe deposit box. 23 years of marriage. And yet, there was a part of his life she had never been allowed into. The most painful part wasn't the secret. It was realizing the man she's loved had felt the need to protect her in secret. The next morning, Evelyn went to the First Cascade Bank in downtown Portland. The bank was in an old gray stone building, the kind of classic architecture left over from the 80s. The air inside was so quiet that the sound of her heels softly on the stone floor. The bank manager was a woman in her 50s named Linda Mercer. She looked at the key, then looked at Evelyn for a long moment before asking quietly, "Are you Evelyn Carter?" Evelyn paused. "Yes," Linda nodded very slowly. "Mr. Carter left instructions in case you came by." Evelyn's heart beat faster. "What instructions?" Linda didn't answer directly. She simply gestured for Evelyn to follow her through the secure corridor leading down to the bank's vault. The space down there was noticeably colder than upstairs. Silver gray metal walls, white fluorescent lights, the smell of old paper and cold steel. Linda stopped in front of a safe deposit box much larger than Evelyn had expected. "You're the only one authorized to open it." Then she quietly left. Evelyn stood alone before the box for a long time before putting the key in the lock. Her hand trembled slightly. Not because of the money, but from an instinct that whatever was inside would completely change the way she saw her marriage. The lock clicked open. Inside wasn't gold or jewelry. It was paper. So much paper. Bank records, company documents, a cream-colored envelope in Thomas's handwriting, and on the very top, a handwritten line for Evelyn only. Evelyn sat down in the small chair in the viewing room and opened the envelope. Inside was a letter. "Evie, if you're reading this, it means things went exactly as I thought they would. I'm so sorry you have to go through all of this after I'm gone." Just that first line was enough to make Evelyn stop. Thomas rarely apologized. He was the kind of man who made things right with actions, not words. Evelyn continued to read. "About a year before I got really sick, I began to realize Grant and Ryan were more interested in my health status than I was. At first, I thought I was being paranoid, but then I started seeing the things I had tried to ignore. The phone calls they thought I couldn't hear, the times they asked about the trust and ownership structure right there in the hospital. The way they talked about the house as if it already belonged to them." Evelyn felt her throat tighten. Thomas knew. He knew all of it. She remembered Grant stepping out into the hospital hallway to take calls. Remembered Ryan asking the doctors meticulously about the treatment timeline, but almost never asking if Thomas was in pain. At the time, Evelyn had just thought that everyone deals with illness in their own way. But Thomas had seen something deeper. Also in the box were copies of emails. Some were printed out. Some were financial reports. Some were investigative notes. Evelyn opened a dark blue file folder. Inside was a report from a financial investigation firm in Seattle. The first line made her blood run cold. "Confidential investigation regarding Grant Carter and Ryan Carter." The pages that followed were like watching a secret life unfold before her eyes. Unpaid personal loans, shell companies, accounts overdrawn by hundreds of thousands of dollars, failed investments, casino debt from Nevada, hidden under a proxy's name. Ryan's was worse. The report showed he'd been using client investment funds to cover losses in his own business. Evelyn had to set the papers down for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't about the money. It was because she finally understood why they were so desperate. Grant and Ryan didn't just want the inheritance. They needed it, at any cost. She opened the next folder. This one contained medical records. A neurological evaluation for Thomas from 6 months before he passed away. Patients of mentally competent, no signs of cognitive impairment affecting legal decision-making. Evelyn sat perfectly still. During Thomas's final weeks, Grant had repeatedly suggested to the lawyer that his father's illness made him emotionally compromised. At the time, she thought it was just his grief talking. Now she realized he was laying the groundwork for something else. There was one more to her envelope. Inside were photographs. Grant meeting an unknown man in a hotel parking lot. Ryan entering the office of a logistics company after hours, several nights in a row. Photos of documents being exchanged. Photos of clandestine meetings. Thomas had been secretly investigating his own sons. It wasn't about the money. It was because he was beginning to fear them. Evelyn brought a hand to her mouth. Suddenly, she remembered a night about 4 months ago. Thomas had been sitting in his study late into the night. Evelyn had woken up around 2 a.m. and seen the light was still on downstairs. When she went down, she found him sitting motionless at his desk, the screen's glow illuminating a face worn down by sickness. "Can't you sleep?" she had asked. Thomas had looked at her for a long moment before finally saying, "Evie, when I'm gone, don't just believe what everyone tells you." At the time, she thought he was just worried about her being alone. Now Evelyn understood. He had been trying to warn her. Finally, the tears came. Not for the estate, not for the numbers on the page. Because for the first time in so many years, she realized Thomas had truly seen the life she had quietly endured in this family. He knew how hard she had tried to be accepted, knew how she had made herself small to avoid conflict, knew she was always the one who had to give in. And at the end of his life, he had tried to make it right in the only way he still could. Evelyn wiped her tears and opened the last folder in the box. She thought she was prepared for anything, but when she saw the words on the first page, she still held her breath for a few seconds. Last Will and Testament of Thomas Carter. The date on it was signed 6 weeks before Thomas died, not the will Grant had shown her. Evelyn didn't open the new will right away. She just sat there, in the small room, in the bank's basement, her hand resting on the document bearing Thomas Carter's name, her heart beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. There are moments in life when you understand that after you move forward, nothing will ever be the same again. This was one of those moments. Outside the thick steel door of the vault, the world went on as usual. People were still depositing money, signing mortgages, rushing to work, calling each other about little things. And here sat Evelyn, surrounded by dozens of files and secrets her husband, of more than 20 years, had quietly carried with him to the end of his life. She opened the last envelope in the box. Inside was a handwritten letter, not printed paper, not a legal document. It was Thomas's handwriting. "Evie, if you're reading this, I suppose I ran out of time to tell you in person." The very first line made Evelyn close her eyes for a few seconds. Thomas always called her Evie. Only he called her that in his final months. Evelyn had almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone say her name with such tenderness. She read on. "The hardest thing in my life wasn't building the company. It wasn't the illness. It wasn't old age. It was accepting that I had failed where I should have been the strongest." Evelyn felt her chest tighten. In that cold room beneath the bank, she suddenly remembered an evening nearly 10 years ago. Ryan had canceled Christmas dinner at the last minute because his new girlfriend wanted to go to Aspen. Ethan had shown up more than 2 hours late and left early to meet a client. After everyone had left, Evelyn had been standing alone in the kitchen, washing dishes. Thomas had come up behind her, put his arm around her shoulder, and said, "Don't be sad. The boys don't mean it. Don't be sad." That was probably what Thomas said most often throughout their marriage. Not, "I'll handle this." Not, "You deserve to be treated with more respect." Just, "Don't be sad," Evelyn read on. "I watched you try for years to become a part of this family. I saw you remember every child's birthday. Saw you stand for hours in the kitchen every holiday. Saw you always be the first to apologize, even when you'd done nothing wrong. And what I'm most ashamed of is that I let it go on for so long." Tears began to fall onto her hands. It wasn't a violent cry, just the feeling of something held back for too long, finally breaking free. Thomas knew. He truly knew. He knew how lonely Evelyn had been in the very house she called a home. Knew what it felt like to be politely excluded from conversations. Knew That every time Ethan said our family without looking at her, she would lie awake for hours afterward, wondering if she was being too sensitive. Knew that Ryan only called when he needed someone to watch his daughter while he was busy. Knew how much Evelyn had tried to make herself smaller to avoid making things awkward. And the most painful part was that Thomas hadn't been blind. He had just been silent. The letter continued. I spent years convincing myself that if I just loved everyone enough, things would eventually work themselves out. I thought time would make my sons accept you. I thought if I just stood in the middle, everything would balance out. But the truth is, I was just avoiding confrontation because I was afraid of losing them. Evelyn put a hand to her mouth. Thomas had never admitted this while he was alive. Never. He was always the peacemaker, always downplaying the problem, always turning her wounds into misunderstandings. For the first time in years, Evelyn understood that sometimes you don't need a perfect man. You just need one who will dare to take your side. But Thomas hadn't done that, not until the very end. She read on, more slowly now. The day I heard Grant talk about our home as an asset before I was even gone, I realized I had raised men who didn't understand the value of gratitude. And what hurts me most is that I left you in the middle of it all alone. Alone. Evelyn closed her eyes. She remembered those nights in hospital when Thomas was drowsy from the morphine. Grant and Ryan would stand in the hallway talking about trusts, taxes, and business continuity as if the man in the room were just part of a succession plan. She had felt uneasy about it then, but she blamed herself for thinking the worst of them. Now she understood her intuition had never been wrong. Thomas wrote on, I'm not leaving you these things for the money. I'm leaving them to you because I know if I don't, you'll keep giving pieces of yourself away until there's nothing left that's your own. You have spent too many years trying to be expelled by people who only ever learned to tolerate your presence. Don't live the rest of your life that way. Evelyn broke down, no longer trying to stay calm. She hunched over, her hands clutching the letter so tightly the edges of the paper crinkled. Some pain doesn't come from being hated. It comes from finally being seen. Thomas had seen her. Too late, but he had seen. A long moment passed before Evelyn was off to read the final part. I know you'll feel guilty, having to choose what happens next with Grant and Ryan. Don't. They aren't boys who need to be protected from consequences anymore. And you are no longer the woman who has to ask for permission to exist in this family. Below the letter was Thomas's familiar signature, a little shaky, but still so clear. Evelyn was just wiping away a tear when there was a soft knock on the vault room door. Linda Mercer was standing there. Mrs. Carter? Evelyn took a deep breath and stood up. Linda handed her a business card. I was told to give you this if you opened the box. Evelyn looked down at the simple white card. Naomi Mercer, estate attorney. Below it, a line was handwritten in blue ink. Call her before speaking to anyone else. An hour later, Evelyn was sitting in Naomi Mercer's small office in East Portland. Naomi was in her early 50s, with short, pale silver hair and eyes that were sharp but calm. Not like the corporate lawyers Grant usually worked with. No attempt to impress. No using complicated words just to prove how smart she was. Naomi finished reading the documents, then looked up at Evelyn for a long time. Thomas Carter is the first man I have ever met who prepared this thoroughly just to protect his wife from his own family. Evelyn clasped her hands lightly. He thought I couldn't handle it. Naomi shook her head. No. She pushed the new will across the desk toward Evelyn. He thought you'd endured for far too long. The room was quiet for a few seconds. Then, Naomi said something that made Evelyn feel like the entire course of her life had just shifted. Evelyn, you now hold the power to decide their future. The next morning, Evelyn's phone started buzzing at 6:13 a.m. The first text was from Ryan. Evelyn, Grant was a little on edge last night. This is hard on everyone. We just want to do what Dad would have wanted. 10 minutes later, Grant, we need to talk before you make any rash decisions. Then Melissa, I think it would break Thomas's heart to see the family start fighting over money. Evelyn read each message in her quiet kitchen, a warm cup of coffee in her hands. A month ago, she would have panicked. She probably would have called back immediately, apologizing for making things tense. She probably would have asked herself if she was being too sensitive. But this morning, for the first time in years, Evelyn was seeing things clearly. Not one of them asked if she'd gotten any sleep. No one asked if she'd eaten. No one asked how she was doing after losing her husband. It was all about what Thomas would have thought, what this would do to the family, how awkward it would all be for them. That's the strangest thing about emotional manipulation in wealthy families. It rarely looks like violence. It often wears a nice suit, speaks softly, uses words like family, respect, peace, doing the right thing, and it makes you feel selfish for just wanting what's fair. Evelyn placed the phone face down on the table. Outside the window, a rare Portland sun broke through after days of rain. A pale light washed over the backyard, where the lavender bushes she'd planted years ago were starting to wilt from neglect. Thomas used to say that garden made the house feel like a real home. The thought made her chest ache. For a very long time, Evelyn believed that if she was gentle enough, patient enough, if she wasn't a bother, then people would love her. But now she understood. Some people only love the convenience you provide. The moment you start having boundaries, they call you difficult. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was Grant calling directly. Evelyn let it go to the last ring before answering. Hello, Grant. Where are you? His voice was level, but there was an undercurrent of panic he was trying to suppress. At home. We need to meet. What for? A few seconds of silence stretched between them. Naomi Mercer. Evelyn didn't answer. Grant exhaled very slowly. I know you met with her. Is that so? Evelyn. His voice dropped. You don't understand how complicated this is. That line had made Evelyn feel small for 20 years. Now, it just made her feel sad. Maybe I'm starting to. Grant switched tactics almost immediately. Dad's been gone less than a week. This is not the time for an outsider to be getting involved in family business. An outsider. Evelyn looked out the window. For over 20 years, she had cooked for this family, cared for their father, organized every holiday, remembered every grandchild's birthday. But the moment she was no longer convenient for them, she instantly became an outsider. Naomi isn't an outsider, Evelyn said softly. She was Thomas's lawyer. Grant was silent. Evelyn could almost hear the gears turning in his head. Dad wasn't lucid toward the end. That sentence sent a chill through Evelyn. She remembered Thomas in his final months. He was tired, in pain, but his mind was still sharper than almost anyone she ever met, and Grant knew that. He just needed a different narrative. Thomas's neurologist would disagree, Evelyn said. The other end of the line went completely silent. It was a moment before Grant spoke again. You've seen the records? It wasn't a question. Evelyn didn't answer. Grant's voice dropped lower. Evelyn, you have to understand. Ryan's struggling. My company isn't doing as well as you think. If this all gets dragged through the courts, it'll ruin all of us. It was the first time Grant had been truly honest, not about what they had done, but about what they were afraid to lose. And what about me? Evelyn asked quietly. Grant paused. What do you mean? In all these years, did you ever once wonder what would happen to me if Thomas was gone? Grant didn't answer, because he never had. Evelyn realized the truth of it didn't hurt anymore. It just made things clear. After the call, Evelyn went up to the bedroom she had shared with Thomas. For the first time since the funeral, she opened her side of the closet. So many dresses she hadn't worn in years. Colors she'd stopped wearing because she thought they weren't age-appropriate anymore. A navy blue sweater Thomas had loved. A pair of leather boots she'd bought but never worn because Grant had once casually remarked they were a little young for her. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and let out a very small laugh. For all these years, she had been slowly fading from her own life without even realizing it. No one had ever forced her to. That was the terrifying part. They just make you feel that being smaller makes you easier to love. That afternoon, Ryan showed up at her door, unannounced. He stood on the porch with a look of genuine exhaustion, the first Evelyn had ever seen on him. Can I come in and talk? Evelyn studied him for a moment, then opened the door. Ryan sat in the kitchen for a long time without saying a word. Finally, he was the one who spoke. Grant's panicking. And you? Ryan gave a dry, humorless laugh. I'm always panicking. Evelyn looked at the man in front of her. For the first time, she saw him without the pretense of being in control. Ryan wrung his hands. You don't understand. If this all gets investigated, we lose everything. Evelyn thought of Thomas's letter. They weren't boys who needed to be shielded from the consequences anymore. Ryan lowered his head. Dad couldn't have done this to us, but he did. What do you want? The question took Evelyn by surprise, because in all these years, no one in this family had ever asked her what she truly wanted. She was silent for a long time. Then she answered honestly, I want for once in my life to not have to apologize for existing. Ryan looked up. There was a subtle shift in his eyes. Perhaps for the first time, he saw Evelyn as a person, not just the shadow standing next to his father. By the time Ryan left, it was getting dark outside. 10 minutes later, Naomi Mercer called. Grant just contacted my office. Evelyn leaned back against the sofa. What does he want? A final meeting. And what do you think? Naomi paused for a few seconds before answering. I think they've just realized you're not the woman they can manipulate anymore. Evelyn looked toward Thomas's study. The door was still ajar. The desk lamp he used every night was still there. And for the first time since her husband died, Evelyn no longer felt like she was just surviving. She was beginning to wake up. Naomi spoke again. Friday, 10 a.m., Victor Hale's office. Evelyn took a deep breath. All right. Naomi paused just before hanging up. Evelyn, yes, this is the meeting that decides everything. On Friday morning, a thin layer of pale gray fog covered Portland. Evelyn arrived at Victor Hale's office 15 minutes early. She wore a cream-colored coat, her hair tied back low with almost no makeup. It wasn't because she wanted to appear strong. It was just that, for the first time in years, she no longer felt the need to present herself in a way that made other people comfortable. Naomi Mercer was already there. She was standing by the conference room window, holding a thick black file. When she saw Evelyn walk in, Naomi just gave a slight nod. Are you okay? Evelyn thought for a few seconds, then answered honestly, I'm not afraid anymore. Naomi looked at her for a long time. That's what they aren't prepared for. Victor's conference room wasn't corporate luxury. No giant glass table, no LED screen. Just a large room with a dark wood table, walls lined with law books, and a soft wet yellow box that made everything feel more real. Grant and Ryan arrived right on time. Grant walked in first in a dark blue suit, a leather briefcase in hand, his face almost perfect if not for the faint dark circles under his eyes. Ryan followed behind, thinner than just a few days ago, his tie slightly askew as if he'd adjusted it many times on the way here. Victor Hale stood to greet them. No one held a handshake for too long. No one smiled. The atmosphere in the room felt more like a surgery than an argument. That's what made it so much more tense. Grant sat down first. Before this goes too far, I think we should clear up a few misunderstandings. Naomi opened the file in front of her. There are no misunderstandings here. Grant looked at her. I don't think you understand our family's history. Naomi didn't react. I understand enough to know that Thomas Carter hired me before he passed because he no longer trusted his own sons. The room fell completely silent. Ryan looked down at the table. Grant slowly leaned back in his chair. Dad was very sick toward the end. Evelyn recognized it immediately. Grant was trying to build the old narrative again, not in his right mind. Influenced, not lucid. But this time, no one else in the room believed him. Naomi pushed a stack of papers toward Victor. Thomas Carter's neuropsychological evaluation 6 months before his death. Full cognitive capacity. Signed by 2 specialists. Victor read a few lines, then put the papers down very slowly. Grant didn't look at the papers. He just looked at Evelyn. Are you really going to do this? No longer, Ev, no more gentle politeness. Now it was guilt. That question used to be enough to make Evelyn shrink. Not anymore. I'm not doing anything, she replied calmly. I'm just finally getting to know the truth. Ryan spoke for the first time. Dad loved us. Naomi nodded. Yes, and that's why he gave you 2 far more chances than you ever deserved. Grant was the first to sign, not because he was admitting defeat, but because for the first time in his life, he understood there was no way left to control the narrative. Evelyn sat quietly on the other side of the conference table, watching the man who had spent nearly his entire life, was the smartest person in the room, slowly sign his name to the papers in front of him. No one said a word. The sound of the pen on the paper was so small, but to Evelyn, it sounded like something finally coming to an end. Ryan signed about 3 minutes after his brother. His hand trembled slightly. Not much. Just enough for Evelyn to realize this was probably the first time Ryan truly understood what a consequence was. For so many years, there had always been someone to clean up their messes. Thomas paid the debts. Thomas fixed the mistakes. Thomas made the calls. Thomas stood in the middle of everything like a soft cushion, stopping life from hitting his sons too hard. But Thomas was dead. And for the first time, there was no one left to stand between them and the consequences. Naomi Mercer closed the folder, and with that, it's done. Grant looked up. Do you really think Dad would have wanted this? The question hung in the room. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Then she answered in the calmest voice she had ever used. I think, in the end, he was just tired. Grant froze. For what was probably the first time in days, he didn't know how to react. Ryan let out a small laugh. It wasn't happy. It was just the laugh of someone who finally understood they'd run too far to go back. He knew all along, Ryan said softly. Didn't he? Naomi didn't answer. There was no need to anymore. It was all laid out on the table. Shell companies, undisclosed loans, forged signatures, drained accounts, a mortgage taken out just before Thomas died. The assets they thought would be their salvation were in reality mountains of debt wrapped in glossy paper. And the worst part for Grant wasn't the money. It was that his own father had seen them so clearly he'd prepared for all of this in advance. No one was handcuffed. No one was dragged out of the boardroom. There were no police, no televised drama, just signatures. Numbers, consequences, incredibly ordinary ones. Sometimes, that's the most terrifying thing of all. 3 weeks later, Ryan had to sell the house in Lake Oswego. Melissa left before the house was officially listed. She left her key on the kitchen counter with a note so short it was almost cruel. I can't do this anymore. Grant tried to keep up appearances for longer. He still went to the office every morning, still wore a tailored suit, still posted professional articles on LinkedIn, as if nothing had happened. But Portland is a small town for people in finance and law. Word travels fast. A major client pulled their contract, then another. A bank started reviewing his personal lines of credit. Grant didn't collapse overnight. He just began to disappear, piece by piece, from the version of the life he thought he would have forever. Evelyn didn't keep track of them. At least she tried not to. But sometimes Naomi would call. Ryan's negotiating bankruptcy. Grant just sold the cabin in Idaho. It sounds like they're trying to refinance, but no one will take them. Each time, Evelyn just stayed quiet. Not happy, not gleeful, just very still. The strangest thing about revenge is that sometimes it doesn't feel like a victory the way you think it will. It just lets you finally breathe. One afternoon in early October, Evelyn went back to the old house one last time to pick up a few remaining boxes of books. The living room was nearly empty. Her footsteps echoed more than they used to. No pictures on the walls, no woolen throw on the sofa, no smell of Thomas's favorite coffee. The house looked like a stage after the play had ended. Evelyn stood for a long time in his old office. The desk had been cleared. The drawer where she'd found the key was now wide open. The Portland afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting a pale yellow light on the hardwood floor. She suddenly remembered an evening, a long time ago, when Thomas had been sitting in that very chair and asked, "Do you ever regret marrying me?" Evelyn had laughed then. What kind of question is that? Thomas looked at her for a long moment before saying, "I just always feel like you've given me more than I've given you." Back then, Evelyn thought he was just being emotional. Only now did she understand. Perhaps Thomas had carried that guilt for more years than she had ever known. Evelyn touched the surface of the desk one last time. Then she left the house and didn't look back. At the end of November, Victor Hale sent her the paperwork confirming that all final procedures were complete. No more disputes, no more legal claims, no more Carter family, just Evelyn, a 63-year-old woman who, for the first time in her life, was no longer living to keep things peaceful for other people. That night, she sat alone in her temporary rental apartment near the Columbia River, opened a small bottle of wine, and watched the lights reflecting on the water. Her phone buzzed once. It was a text from Ryan, just a single line. "I think Dad trusted you more than he ever trusted himself." Evelyn read it for a long time. Then she turned off the screen. She didn't reply. Outside the glass door, the winter wind was starting to blow in from the coast. And for the first time in many months, Evelyn felt the future was no longer a terrifying void, but rather a road she was finally allowed to choose for herself. 6 months later, Evelyn Carter moved to Astoria. The small coastal town in northern Oregon didn't seem like a place where people started their lives over at 63. No fancy restaurants, no modern skyline, no country club. Just the ocean, the cold wind, the small steep streets, and the salty smell that clung to the air from morning until night. Evelyn rented a pale blue wooden house about a 10-minute walk from the shore. The house was much smaller than the one she had shared with Thomas, but strangely, for the first time in years, she felt a place truly belonged to her. Not because of its value. It wasn't about the paperwork. It was because no one in that house made her feel like she was taking up someone else's space. Her first morning in Astoria, Evelyn woke at 6 out of habit. For the first few seconds, she still thought she needed to get Thomas's medication ready. Then, the silence of the room reminded her that that life was over. Evelyn lay for a few more minutes, watching the gray-blue light outside the window. Before, her mornings had always started with someone else's needs. Thomas liked his coffee stronger in the winter. Ryan was allergic to the kind of marmalade with the peel in it. Grant didn't eat sweet bread. Her entire life had revolved around anticipating what other people needed before they even had to ask. And now, for the first time in her life, nobody needed anything from her. The thought used to scare her. Now, it felt like freedom. Evelyn pulled on a sweater and walked down to the water. The Astoria morning was cold enough to see your breath plume in front of your face. Seagulls called in the distance. Small fishing boats bobbed in the harbor. She walked slowly along the boardwalk, hands tucked in her jacket pockets, letting the wind toss loose strands of gray hair against her cheek. Some losses never really go away. But the human body is a strange thing. It keeps moving forward anyway, even when the heart thinks it can't. A week after moving to Astoria, Evelyn started clearing out the small garden behind the house. The soil here was damper than in Portland. Weeds grew fast. The old flower bushes had been neglected for months. She spent that first whole afternoon just pulling weeds in silence. Her hands ached. Her back was sore. But it was the kind of tired that lets you sleep well. Thomas had loved her old garden. Every spring, he'd bring home new pots of lavender, all while pretending to complain that Evelyn bought too many plants. He told her once, "You make every place feel truly lived in." Evelyn had just smiled back then. Thinking back on it now, maybe Thomas had always known his wife was better at keeping things alive than he was, including their family, including him. But no one can hold everything together on their own forever. One afternoon at a grocery store near the docks, Evelyn met June. 70 years old, a widow with short white hair and a way of talking to you like she'd known you for years. June struck up a conversation simply because Evelyn was standing in front of the tomatoes for too long. Are you trying to pick the perfect one, or are you just reminiscing? Evelyn let out a real laugh for the first time in months. Probably a little of both. June told her which local olive oil was the best in town, then invited her to the garden club on Thursday. It started as simply as that. No one asked Evelyn how much money she had. No one cared what house she used to live in. No one saw her as an extension of someone else. In Astoria, Evelyn was just Evelyn. And that, it turned out, was enough. She started cooking again. Not the big dinners for 12 people like before, just for herself. Seafood chowder on rainy days. Toasted bread with rosemary from the backyard garden. Simple pasta with butter and garlic on nights she was too tired to think too much. For the first time in her life, Evelyn realized she had no idea what she liked to eat. For years, she had only cooked what other people liked. The thought made her stand for a long time in her small kitchen, watching the soup simmer. A woman can lose herself in very quiet ways, not in one big event. But in the thousands of times she automatically put someone else's needs first. One afternoon in late March, Naomi Mercer called her. There's an organization in Astoria looking for a volunteer to support older who've experienced financial abuse. Evelyn was quiet for a few seconds. Financial abuse. She had always thought abuse had to be yelling or violence. No one ever told her that sometimes it looks like being kept out of all financial decisions, always having to apologize for spending money, being made to feel like you don't understand anything, or being treated like you're temporary in your own family. I don't know if I'm the right person for it, Evelyn said softly. Naomi gave a gentle laugh. The fact that you think that is exactly why you are. The support center was in an old building near the town library. The first day she went, Evelyn almost turned back around. She wasn't used to talking about herself. She wasn't used to showing up somewhere just for her. But then she met Elena, 68 years old. Her husband passed 2 years ago. Her son sold the house she'd lived in for 30 years without explaining what the papers she was signing were. Then she met Margaret, a woman who had let her husband manage all their accounts for 40 years, only to discover she was left with almost nothing after he died. Evelyn sat and listened to their stories in the small room that smelled of hot tea and old paper. And for the first time, she understood what happened to her wasn't as rare as she had thought. So many women spend their lives as the emotional center of the family, only to be pushed out of the center of every decision. No one hit them. No one yelled at them. People just slowly made them believe that they didn't need to understand. Metal, I don't need to know, I just need to trust. That evening, Evelyn walked home along the coast. The wind was stronger than usual. Waves crashed against the rocks under a cold silver sunset. She stopped for a long time, looking out at the sea. Then she was struck by a realization that made her eyes sting. For the first time in her life, she was existing without needing anyone's permission, without trying to be accepted, without making herself smaller to keep the peace, without apologizing for taking up space in a room, simply living. And as it turned out, that feeling was far more beautiful than Evelyn had ever imagined. Her first summer in Astoria was slow to arrive. The coast of Northern Oregon wasn't like the vacation photos people post online. The water was still cold. The wind was still strong. Fog still rolled into town most mornings, as if winter wasn't quite ready to leave. But Evelyn was starting to love it. Astoria didn't try to be anything else. It just was what it was. Maybe that was also why she stayed. 3 months after she started by volunteering at the Women's Support Center, Naomi Mercer drove down to Astoria to meet her one Saturday afternoon. The two of them sat in a small coffee shop near the docks, the glass windows fogged over from a light rain. Naomi placed a stack of papers on the table. "I think you should see this." Evelyn opened it. It was the incorporation paperwork for a nonprofit foundation. She looked up. "Naomi, you've helped so many women in just a few months," Naomi said. "Not with money, but by making them feel like they aren't crazy." Evelyn was silent. She knew that feeling all too well. The feeling of being gaslit for so long you start to doubt your own intuition. Being treated like an outsider, but told you're being too sensitive if you get upset. Being left out of every decision, but still called family whenever your sacrifice was needed. Naomi gently stirred her tea. "Thomas left you more than just that money." Evelyn looked out the window at the sea. "He left me with the feeling of finally being seen." Naomi didn't say anything. Some truths don't need any more words. 2 months later, the Evelyn Carter Foundation officially opened. No big office, no galas, no press. Just a small rented house near the town library, with 3 part-time employees and a few old wooden desks. They helped older women understand financial paperwork, free legal connections, explaining trusts, mortgages, and inheritance in plain English, not in language that makes people feel stupid. Evelyn didn't want to build a place that made women feel saved. She just wanted them to stop feeling invisible. One September morning, Elena stopped by the center with a homemade apple pie. "I just opened my very first bank account in my own name," she said, her eyes welling up. Evelyn held her for a long time. It reminded her of the first time she'd signed her own lease, back in Astoria. Her hand had trembled, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar feeling of her life finally, truly being her own. Grant never reached out again. Ryan did. Not often, just a short email now and then, an old photo of Thomas. Once, a picture of the lavender bush in the old garden, blooming again. No one mentioned the lawsuit or the inheritance anymore. It was as if they were 2 survivors of the same house fire. No longer close, but no longer pretending either. One late autumn evening, Evelyn received a small package from Portland. Inside was the old watch Thomas used to wear every day. There was no sender's name, just a single note. "Dad wore this every day after marrying you." Evelyn sat for a long time, the watch resting in her hand. She thought about Thomas more than she used to, but in a softer way. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was truth. Thomas had loved her, but sometimes love isn't enough without courage. So many men think that keeping quiet to keep the peace is a kindness, until the woman beside them just fades away in her own life. Thomas realized that too late, but at least, in the end, he did. That afternoon, Evelyn walked down to the ocean. Astoria was getting colder. The wind was stronger. The waves crashed against the rocky shore with a deep sound, like the breathing of something ancient. She sat on an old wooden bench, looking out at the silvery gray water that stretched to the horizon. No one knew how much money she'd once had. No one here cared. She was no longer Thomas Carter's wife. No longer the woman trying to keep the peace at family dinners. No longer a shadow sitting next to someone else. Just Evelyn. A 63-year-old woman was learning to live the rest of her life under her own name. She remembered Thomas asking her once, "If you could live your life all over again, would you still choose this one?" Back then, Evelyn had answered yes without hesitation. If she were asked again now, her answer would probably be different. Not because she regretted loving Thomas, but because she wished she had loved herself sooner. The late afternoon sun sank slowly toward the sea. A pale orange light stretched across the cold water. Evelyn pulled her coat a little tighter and smiled softly. Life was finally quiet. Not the lonely quiet of the house after the funeral, but the quiet of a person who no longer had to fight to belong somewhere. And perhaps that was the real legacy Thomas had left her. Not the money, not the house, not the inheritance, but the final chance for Evelyn to understand that her worth should never have depended on whether other people chose to love her or not. Because sometimes the most painful thing isn't having money taken from you. It's realizing you spent far too many years trying to be loved by people who were merely tolerating your presence. And now I want to ask you this. Have you ever stayed too long in a place where you were tolerated instead of truly loved? Thank you for staying with the story today. If there's one thing Evelyn learned after all of this, it's this. Don't wait until life takes everything away to start asking yourself what you truly deserve. Some people will only love your sacrifice. Some places will only keep you around as long as you're convenient. And there are years we live making ourselves so small just to be accepted. But life doesn't end there. Sometimes the most beautiful chapter begins very late. After loss, after betrayal, after we finally understand that peace is more important than being validated by others. If this story resonated with you, please leave a comment below. I really want to know, have you ever stayed too long somewhere you no longer felt valued? And if you enjoy deep stories about family, truth, healing, and second chances in life, subscribe to the channel to join us for our future stories. I'll see you in the next video.